The shattered morning. The morning sun stretched its golden rays across the Rivera estate, painting the wide marble floors with a soft glow that should have promised peace. But peace had become a stranger in the house. Elena Rivera, only 23, walked slowly down the wide staircase, her heels echoing gently against the polished stone. She had grown up within these walls that gleamed with wealth, but also walls that had trained her to walk silently, to exist without causing ripples, to smile when told and remain invisible when needed. Being the daughter of Senator Gabriel Rivera had meant her entire childhood had been carefully choreographed, like a dance where every step was judged by others, every gesture measured for political value. Elena had become good at being flawless, but she had also become good at burying her own desires deep within herself where no one could see. This morning, however, felt different. She had sensed it before she even reached the bottom of the stairs. The staff usually moved with a calm rhythm, but now they whispered in corners, glancing nervously at her before lowering their eyes. Phones rang and were answered in hushed tones. Conversations died whenever she entered a room, and even the usual clinking of breakfast plates in the dining hall seemed muted, as though the house itself held its breath. Her father's study door was shut, and through the dark oak panel she thought she could hear the faint sound of pacing. It was unusual because Senator Rivera was a man known for control, known for a calm presence that inspired followers and silenced critics. Yet something in the atmosphere told Elena that control was slipping. She hesitated only briefly before knocking softly and pushing open the heavy door. Her father stood by the wide glass window, looking out into the manicured gardens that had always been a source of pride to the family. But instead of admiring the roses that had just begun to bloom, he stood stiff, shoulders weighted as if the entire world pressed against his back. His face was pale, his strong jaw tight, and for the first time in her life, Elena saw fear in his eyes when he turned to face her. She froze at the sight. Her father was not a man who revealed weakness. His career had been built on an image of strength, decisiveness, and authority. But in that moment, he looked like someone cornered by shadows too powerful to escape. "Papa," she whispered, closing the door gently behind her. "What is happening?" She wanted to sound calm, but her voice betrayed her. She perched carefully on the edge of the leather chair across from his massive oak desk, her hands folded in her lap, the way she had been taught during countless formal dinners. She braced herself because instinct told her that life as she knew it was about to unravel. Her father cleared his throat, but the sound was strained, as if every word carried a weight he did not wish to lift. "There is an investigation," he said, his voice low, almost trembling. "It is about some business dealings from many years ago. Things I believed were settled, buried, forgotten, but they have resurfaced." His words seemed to hang in the air, heavy and immovable. Elena's chest tightened as if invisible hands gripped her lungs. "How bad is it?" she asked, though she feared the answer. His eyes, dark with despair, met hers. "Bad enough that we could lose everything. Not only the house, not only the respect we have built for decades, but also our freedom. I could face prison. Our family name could be destroyed." Elena's world tilted. She had always believed her father untouchable, a man who made laws rather than broke them, a man who outmaneuvered enemies with skill and confidence. To hear him admit defeat was like watching a fortress collapse stone by stone. She struggled to keep her expression neutral, though panic roared inside her like a storm. "There must be something we can do," she murmured, though she already suspected her father had thought of every angle. He sank slowly into the chair behind his desk, creating a physical barrier between them that seemed to symbolize the distance of power and decisions. "There is a solution," he said at last, each word deliberate, cautious. "A way to protect you, to protect your brothers, to protect everything our family has built." His tone carried the same weight she had heard in political negotiations, that cold edge that always demanded sacrifice. Elena's heartbeat quickened. She recognized that tone. It was the tone he used when he had already decided, when he would present it as though it were the only option left. "What kind of solution?" Her father hesitated only briefly before saying a name that was both familiar and distant. Damian Cross. The name struck her like an unexpected gust of wind. She had read about him in newspapers, had seen his name in business magazines. Damian Cross, the billionaire founder of Cross Enterprises, one of the most powerful technology companies in the nation. Known for brilliance, ruthless efficiency, and a reclusive lifestyle, he was both admired and feared. Yet he was a stranger to her world, existing only as a headline and a shadow. I don't understand, she said softly. Her father finally looked at her directly. His eyes carried regret but also a grim determination. He has agreed to marry you. The words slammed into her chest like a physical blow. She gripped the arms of her chair, the polished leather digging into her palms as she fought for steady breaths. Marry me? But I've never even met him. That is not important right now, Senator Rivera said, his voice rough with shame. What matters is that he has the influence, the power, the resources to make our problems vanish. His connections can ensure that this investigation never reaches us. In return, he requires something. Elena's voice shook despite her attempt to remain composed. And what exactly does he get out of marrying me? What does he gain from this arrangement? Respectability, stability, social acceptance. He has never been married, never formed attachments that anyone knows of. A wife like you, graceful, educated, trained in the world of politics and society, will serve as the perfect partner in his world. You will be more than a wife. You will be an asset. That is what he wants. And in return, he will protect this family from ruin. Elena stared at her father, the man who had always been her protector, realizing with growing horror that he was now asking her to protect him, to protect them all by giving up her freedom. And if I refuse? She asked, her voice almost a whisper. The silence that followed was thick and heavy, louder than any shout could have been. Her father did not need to answer. The truth lingered in the air. If she said no, prison awaited him, disgrace would swallow their name, and everything she had grown up with would crumble into dust. She could not bear to imagine her younger brothers' futures destroyed, their lives marked by scandal. When? She asked quietly, because deep down she already knew she had no choice. The wedding is scheduled for next month, her father replied, but he wishes to meet you first, a dinner to discuss expectations. Elena stood, her legs trembling, her heart thundering. She could not breathe in that suffocating study any longer. I need air, she whispered, moving quickly toward the door before her father could stop her. She rushed through the halls blindly, past staff who avoided her eyes, past ringing phones until she found herself in the garden where she had once played as a child. She sank onto the cold marble bench, the roses blooming around her, mocking her with their beauty. She had dreamed once of love, of choosing her own future. Now she was to be sold into an arrangement dressed as a marriage, traded like a political favor. But even as despair threatened to drown her, a small flame flickered inside. If this was to be her fate, then she would not go silently. She would find a way to carve her own path within the cage they had built for her. She would protect her loved ones, but she would not let her spirit die. She lifted her chin, wiped her tears, and whispered to herself, if this is my life now, I will make it mine. 3 days later, Elena sat in an exclusive restaurant, her navy dress carefully chosen to reflect elegance without arrogance. She waited for Damien Cross, the man who was about to shape her destiny. As she watched the door open and saw him step inside, tall, sharp, and commanding, the air shifted. She felt the weight of what was coming, but also, deep within her, the beginning of something unexpected. Not love, not hope yet, but the quiet stirrings of courage. The reluctant agreement. The restaurant was the kind of place Elena had only read about in glossy magazines, a sanctuary for the city's wealthiest men and women, where every chandelier sparkled with imported crystal, and every glass of wine cost more than a family's monthly income. As she sat at the table reserved under Damien Cross's name, Elena felt the stares of others brushing against her skin. She was not unknown to society. Her face had appeared in countless event photographs alongside her father's. But tonight, she was here not as the senator's daughter, but as a young woman who was about to meet the man who held her family's future in the palm of his hand. Her palms were damp as she folded them on the table, willing herself to appear calm. The navy blue dress she had chosen was elegant but modest, reflecting both restraint and defiance. She wanted him to see that she was not a pawn dressed for seduction, but a woman with dignity. The moment Damien entered the restaurant, the energy of the room shifted. People lowered their voices. Waiters straightened their postures, and even the wealthy patrons who normally moved with careless confidence watched him with the quiet respect reserved for kings. Damien Cross walked with purpose, his tall frame carrying an authority that made space part before him. His hair was dark, his features sharp, his tailored suit perfectly aligned with the kind of man who had built an empire on discipline and precision. Elena caught her breath. She had expected someone cold, perhaps unapproachable, but the reality was more complex. He exuded power, yes, but also carried a loneliness in his stride, a weight of silence that clung to him. When he reached her table, he extended his hand in greeting. "Miss Rivera." His voice was deep, calm, measured, like a man accustomed to being heard without raising his tone. Elena stood, her grip steady, though her heart raced. "Mr. Cross," she replied, her tone polite but edged with quiet resistance. "Though I am not sure I had much choice in meeting you tonight." His lips curved in the faintest hint of a smile, the kind that never reached the eyes but acknowledged her courage. "Directness," he said as they both sat. "I appreciate that. It will make our arrangement much simpler." The waiter arrived almost immediately, a sign that Damien's presence was not new here. Without glancing at the menu, he ordered in a voice that suggested he did not tolerate mistakes. Elena gave her own order softly, noting how even the waiter seemed to exhale relief when he left the table. For a few minutes, they engaged in small talk about the restaurant and the weather, both circling around the truth that hung between them like a glass wall. Finally, Damien leaned back in his chair, his gaze fixed firmly on her. "Let us be clear," he began. "This marriage will be a partnership, nothing more. I require a wife who can attend social functions, represent my company with grace, and silence the whispers that a man in my position should not remain unattached. In return, I will ensure your father's troubles vanish completely. His legal issues will dissolve, his reputation preserved. That is my offer." Elena's chest tightened at his bluntness. She had expected some attempt at charm, some effort to soften the truth. But instead, he laid it bare, like a contract on the table. "And what about what I want?" she asked before she could stop herself, her voice firmer than she intended. For the first time, Damien's expression shifted. His eyes, dark and unreadable, studied her as though she were a puzzle. "What do you want, Miss Rivera?" he asked, and there was no mockery in his voice, only curiosity. The question caught her off guard. No one had asked her that in years. Her life had always been a series of obligations, smiling at political dinners, attending charity events, representing her father's flawless image. Her own dreams had been tucked away, dismissed as distractions. But now, in front of this man who was offering her a gilded cage, she found herself speaking honestly. "I wanted to finish college," she said quietly, her voice laced with longing. "I was studying education. I wanted to teach children, help those who do not have the advantages I have had. And now," she glanced down at her hands, fingers curled against her lap, "now I suppose I meant to be nothing more than a corporate wife." "Why not both?" Damien asked, his tone sharper than expected. Her eyes lifted, startled. "You mean, you would allow me to continue?" "I see no reason why marriage should stop you from pursuing your education or career aspirations," he said matter-of-factly. "In fact, it would serve me well. A wife who dedicates herself to education and social causes reflects positively on my company's image. It would not only benefit you, but also me." Elena blinked, studying him carefully. He was not saying this as a kindness, but as strategy. Yet the possibility still flickered like a small light in the dark. "You truly would not mind?" "I would prefer it," he replied. And for a moment his eyes softened, revealing something buried beneath the businessman's armor. "A wife with her own accomplishments is far more valuable than one who exists solely as an ornament." Their food arrived, and silence stretched between them as they ate, each lost in thought. Elena stole glances at him when she thought he wasn't looking. Despite his success, his composure, there was an emptiness about him, a shadow of a man who had built everything alone and found no one to share it with. When dessert was served, Elena finally dared to ask the question that had burned in her mind since the moment her father uttered Damien's name. "Why marriage? Why not simply hire someone to manage your social appearances?" Damien was quiet for a long time, so long that Elena wondered if he would ignore the question. But when he spoke, his voice carried an honesty that startled her. "Because hiring someone implies temporary employment. Marriage implies commitment, stability, permanence. My business partners and competitors need to see that I am capable of more than quarterly profits. They need to believe I understand long-term responsibility." She studied him carefully. "And you have never considered marrying for love?" A faint shadow crossed his face, and his reply was almost too soft to hear. "Love is a luxury I have never been able to afford." Elena's chest tightened at the sadness in his tone, subtle but unmistakable. She wondered what kind of wounds had shaped him into this man who valued contracts over companionship. "What about your family?" she asked gently. "Do they not have opinions about who you marry?" "My parents died when I was 16, he said without hesitation, his tone flat as though he had rehearsed the line too many times in his life. "I have been on my own ever since." "I'm sorry," Elena said sincerely, though the words felt inadequate. "It was a long time ago," Damien replied, cutting the conversation short. He signaled for the check, his movements precise as though even personal discussions must be managed with efficiency. When the waiter left, he turned back to her. "So, Miss Rivera, what is your decision?" Elena looked around the restaurant, at the couples laughing softly, at the families enjoying meals together, at strangers living lives untouched by deals and arrangements. Her own life was being negotiated like a business transaction, her freedom traded for protection. She swallowed hard. "Do I truly have a choice?" "There is always a choice," Damien said evenly. "The question is whether you can live with the consequences of each one." His words, though blunt, carried a strange kind of respect. He was not pretending this was romance. He was not sugarcoating the reality. He was offering her the truth, however cruel it might be. Elena straightened her shoulders, her voice steady. "If I agree, then I want conditions of my own." Damien's eyebrow arched slightly. "Such as?" "I finish my degree. I continue with my studies. I choose the charitable causes I support. And I want my own space in whatever house we will live in. A place that is mine. Done." The speed of his agreement startled her. "Just like that?" she asked, skeptical. "Just like that," he replied. "Anything else?" Elena thought carefully. "Yes, I want honesty. No games, no pretending this is something it is not. But also no cruelty. We may not love each other, but we do not have to hurt each other either." Something flickered in his expression, the faintest shift, as if her words reached some quiet place within him. He nodded slowly. "Agreed." They shook hands across the table, sealing a pact that was both salvation and captivity. As Damien helped her into her coat, Elena caught sight of herself in the restaurant's mirror. Outwardly, she was the same young woman who had entered, but inside everything had changed. She was no longer simply the senator's daughter. In a month, she would be Damien Cross's wife. As his black car disappeared into the night, Elena stood on the curb for a long moment, the city lights blurring in her eyes. She whispered to herself, not as surrender, but as a promise, "If this is the path I must walk, then I will walk it with strength." The marriage without love. The wedding day arrived with a quietness that felt almost unnatural. For most brides, the morning was filled with laughter, flowers, music, and the excited hum of relatives fluttering around like birds. But for Elena Rivera, the morning was still heavy and efficient, stripped of any warmth. There was no lace veil chosen after months of dreaming, no bouquet of flowers picked for their fragrance or meaning. Instead, there was a single envelope waiting on her dresser with instructions from Damien's assistant. Time, place, attire. Even her dress was not her choice. It was a simple ivory gown, elegant in cut but empty of character, as though it had been selected for a mannequin rather than a bride. When she stood before the mirror, staring at herself in the pale silk, Elena felt less like a bride and more like a contract written in flesh and bone. Her father did not escort her down the aisle. There was no aisle. There was no church. There was only a judge waiting in a small chamber, two witnesses standing stiffly in the background, and Damien Cross at her side, composed and unshakable. He wore a tailored black suit, and though his expression was unreadable, his posture suggested complete control. His hand brushed lightly against her back as they approached the desk where the judge stood. To an outsider, it might have looked like a gesture of support. To Elena, it felt like the polite pressure of a man reminding her of the gravity of their agreement. The ceremony was over in minutes. No music played, no vows were whispered, no tears of joy sparkled in anyone's eyes. The judge spoke words that carried legal weight but no sentiment, and they both signed their names on papers that bound them not by affection, but by necessity. The single photograph taken by Damien's lawyer's assistant captured them standing side by side, unsmiling, their eyes forward, as if they were already prepared for the headlines. Elena barely recognized herself in that photograph. She looked calm, collected, dignified, an image for society to consume. But beneath the surface, her heart was racing with the knowledge that she had just stepped into a life she had not chosen. 3 hours later, Elena found herself in the back of a sleek black car, staring out at the winding road that climbed toward the Cross estate. The mansion appeared on the horizon like something pulled from a different world, a fortress of glass and steel, standing proud against the hillside, reflecting the sun in sharp angles. It was intimidating in its perfection, a place built not for warmth but for display. As the car rolled through the iron gates, Elena pressed her hand against the cool window, her breath fogging the glass. This was her home now. This was where she was expected to live, to perform, to adapt. Damien was silent beside her, his phone in his hand, his mind clearly elsewhere. When the car stopped in front of the massive doors, he slid the device into his pocket and turned to her with the same composed politeness he had shown since their first meeting. "The staff will help you settle," he said. "We can discuss household arrangements over dinner, if that suits you." His tone was formal, professional, as though they were business partners dividing tasks in a project. Elena forced herself to nod, her voice steady even as her chest tightened. "That will be fine." The doors opened and the mansion swallowed her whole. The interior was breathtaking in its grandeur, soaring ceilings, endless windows, and halls lined with art that belonged in museums. But instead of marveling at it, Elena felt dwarfed, like a fragile figure dropped into a world that was too vast, too cold. The furniture was modern, sleek, and expensive, but it lacked comfort. Everything was perfect, but nothing was welcoming. A middle-aged woman with kind eyes and graying hair approached them. She smiled warmly, a small spark of humanity in the otherwise intimidating space. "Mrs. Cross," she said, her voice gentle. "I'm Elena, the house manager. Welcome home." The name sounded strange to Elena's ears. Mrs. Cross. She almost turned to look behind her, expecting someone else to respond. It was a title she had not chosen, a name that felt like a costume she had been forced to wear. Still, she managed a small smile. "Thank you, Elena. It's nice to meet you. I've prepared the East Wing for you," Elena continued. "It has its own sitting room, bedroom, and study. I thought you might appreciate some privacy while you adjust." Elena glanced at Damien, surprised. He had remembered her request for her own space. A flicker of something, perhaps gratitude, perhaps confusion, passed through her eyes. He gave a short nod in acknowledgement but said nothing. Then, with a glance at his watch, he excused himself. "I'll be in my office if you need me. Dinner will be at 7. And just like that, he disappeared down a corridor, already absorbed back into the empire he controlled. Elena stood in the cavernous entryway, feeling both relieved at his absence and abandoned by his retreat. She followed Elena through hallways decorated with abstract paintings and sculptures that probably cost more than entire houses. At last, they arrived at the East Wing, a softer space painted in creams and blues. It was beautiful, almost serene, and Elena felt a small measure of relief. For the first time since the wedding, she could breathe without the weight of eyes on her. When Elena left her alone, Elena sat by the window, gazing out at the sprawling gardens below. The world she had entered was one of power, silence, and endless expectations. Yet in the privacy of her new room, she whispered the same promise she had made to herself days earlier. "If this is my life now, I will make it mine." She would not let herself disappear within these glass walls. She would finish her education. She would carve out her space. She would claim pieces of herself even in this arrangement. That evening, dinner was served in a grand dining hall that could have seated 50, yet only 2 places were set at the long table. Damien sat at one end, Elena at the other, the distance between them almost comical in its formality. The meal was exquisite, each course prepared with precision, but the silence between them was thick. Damien spoke only of practical matters, the schedule of social events she would need to attend, the role she was expected to play, the public appearances where her presence would be essential. He outlined it like a strategy, each event a chess piece on a board. Elena listened quietly, nodding when appropriate, but inside she burned. She was more than a chess piece, more than a polished accessory, yet she also saw glimpses of something unexpected. Whenever she asked a question or voiced a thought, Damien listened. Truly listened. He did not dismiss her words. He considered them, weighed them, and responded with respect. It was a small thing, but in a life where she had been invisible for so long, it mattered. When dinner ended, Damien stood buttoning his jacket. "Good night, Elena," he said, his voice polite but firm. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, as though something else hovered on his tongue. But then he turned and left her to the silence of the mansion once more. As she walked back to her room, the echoes of her footsteps trailing behind her, Elena realized the truth. This was not a marriage of love nor of companionship. It was a marriage of convenience, a bargain struck in shadows. But within the stillness of her new home, she also realized something else. This was the beginning of a test, not only of her endurance but of her ability to shape a destiny out of circumstances she had not chosen. She was no longer just her father's daughter, nor merely Damien Cross's wife. She was Elena Rivera, and though her cage was gilded, she would find a way to spread her wings. Breaking the chains, the days that followed the wedding unfolded with a rhythm that at first felt suffocating. Elena woke in the east wing of the Cross Mansion, a space that belonged to her in name but not yet in spirit. Each morning the staff moved with silent precision, delivering breakfast trays with silver lids and politely retreating, leaving her alone in rooms too large for one person. At first she wandered the halls like a ghost, trying to understand the fortress that had become her home. The walls seemed to hum with silence, the kind of silence that pressed into the chest and demanded acknowledgement. But slowly she began to find her own patterns within the mansion's rigid order. True to his word, Damien did not interfere with her personal space. He allowed her the privacy of her wing, the freedom to decorate the study with her own books and the quiet she needed to think. And true to his promise at the restaurant, he encouraged her to continue her education. Within 2 weeks, his assistant had arranged for her to re-enroll in her university program, though discreetly, to keep attention away from the media. For the first time since the deal had been struck, Elena felt a spark of hope. She spent hours immersed in her coursework, returning to the subjects she had once loved: child development, education theory, the psychology of learning. It was not the life she had dreamed of, but it was something she could claim as her own, and it anchored her against the tides of uncertainty. Her presence in the mansion, however, did not go unnoticed. The staff regarded her with curiosity and in time quiet admiration. Unlike the cold efficiency that had ruled the halls before her arrival, Elena spoke to them with kindness, remembered their names, and listened to their stories. The cook, a woman named Maribel, often slipped her extra desserts, laughing at Elena's delighted reactions. Elena, the house manager, became a confidant of sorts, guiding her gently through the maze of expectations without condescension. The staff had grown accustomed to Damien's reserved nature, his distant authority. Elena was different. She brought warmth into rooms that had long been ruled by shadows. Her first public appearance as Damien's wife came sooner than she expected. A charity gala, filled with politicians, investors, and social elites, required her presence at his side. Elena prepared nervously, choosing a gown that balanced elegance with modesty. She feared the whispers, the judgmental glances of those who would see her as nothing more than a strategic pawn. But when she entered the ballroom with Damien's hand resting lightly against her back, the whispers died into silence. Damien was not a man who flaunted affection, but his composure and steady gaze commanded respect, and standing beside him, Elena discovered something unexpected. His presence, though intimidating, shielded her from the worst of society's cruelty. People spoke to her with deference not because of who she was, but because of who he was. Yet beneath the glittering chandeliers, Elena saw something others did not. When Damien spoke with investors, when he shook hands with political figures, his smile never reached his eyes. He carried himself with the ease of a man in control, but his silences were heavy, his posture rigid. It was in the rare, unguarded moments, when he thought no one was watching, that she glimpsed the truth. Loneliness clung to him like a shadow. His life was a fortress of power, but it was also a cage built by loss and sacrifice, and though she had entered this world unwillingly, she began to wonder what kind of man lived behind the armor of suits and strategies. Back at the mansion, their relationship remained formal, but it began to shift in subtle ways. Damien never sought unnecessary conversation, but when Elena spoke, he listened. One evening, as they sat across the cavernous dining table, she told him about a project she wanted to start. an outreach program for underprivileged children in the city, offering tutoring and resources. She expected him to dismiss it as frivolous. Instead, he nodded. "Draft a proposal," he said. "My foundation can support it." The swiftness of his agreement startled her, but she realized then that he valued action, not sentiment. If she brought him ideas with structure and purpose, he would back them. This realization fueled her resolve. She began spending her afternoons working on the proposal, and in doing so, she discovered her own strength. She was not just enduring this arrangement. She was shaping it. She was carving a place for herself within a world that had threatened to erase her. But not everyone welcomed her presence. At the gala and other events that followed, Elena noticed the sharp eyes of Damien's rivals and competitors. They saw her not as a woman, but as a vulnerability, a potential weakness in his otherwise impenetrable armor. Some smiled too sweetly, others whispered too quietly, and she understood that danger in this new life was not only about reputation, it was about survival in a world where power was currency and betrayal was a constant risk. One night, as she walked through the mansion's east corridor, she overheard Damien in his office, his voice low but tense. He was speaking to someone on the phone, his words clipped, his tone sharper than usual. "No, I will not renegotiate. They can try their threats, but they will not succeed." The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the sound of a glass being set forcefully on the desk. Elena lingered by the doorway, her heart racing. She had suspected that his empire was built on more than clean contracts and boardroom victories, but to hear the undercurrent of conflict unsettled her. For the first time, she realized that stepping into this marriage meant stepping into battles she had never imagined. Later, when she entered the dining hall, Damien was already seated, his expression unreadable. She wanted to ask about the phone call, about the threats she had overheard, but she stopped herself. Instead, she spoke of her classes, her ideas for the outreach program. To her surprise, his shoulders relaxed and the corners of his mouth softened as he listened. It was then she understood. Her presence was not only a shield for her family, it was slowly becoming a balm for his own isolation. The weeks turned into months, and Elena discovered resilience she had not known she possessed. She balanced university assignments with social obligations, her quiet projects with the loud demands of public appearances. She began to see Damien less as the stranger who had bought her future, and more as a man fighting his own invisible battles. She still did not trust him fully, but she respected the discipline that had shaped him. And in the moments when his gaze lingered on her a little too long, when silence between them felt less like distance and more like recognition, she began to wonder whether the chains that bound them both could also forge something stronger. From deal to destiny, the mansion no longer felt like a stranger's house. After months of carving her own space within its endless corridors, Elena had begun to transform it in quiet ways. Flowers placed in vases where only cold sculptures had stood. The sound of piano music drifting from the east wing when she played to soothe her mind. The laughter of children from the outreach program she had founded, when she invited them to visit the gardens for special lessons. What had once been a fortress of glass and silence had slowly begun to hum with warmth. Even the staff whispered about it, marveling at how the young Mrs. Cross had softened the edges of a world once ruled by nothing but steel. But beneath the fragile peace, storm clouds gathered. Damien had grown more tense in recent weeks. His phone calls were longer, his voice sharper. Rivals in the corporate world, sensing that his new marriage might have distracted him, began pressing harder against his empire. Rumors spread in the press, whispers of corruption and betrayals, and though Elena had no proof, she knew in her heart that someone wanted to see Damien fall. She had overheard fragments of conversations, hints of deals collapsing, threats disguised as negotiations. For the first time, she realized that the bargain she had entered into was not just about saving her father. It was also about stepping into a battlefield where power was fought for in shadows. One night, as rain lashed against the windows and the mansion stood shrouded in storm, Damien came to the east wing. His presence there was unusual. He rarely intruded into her private space unless invited. He looked exhausted, his suit still perfect but his eyes shadowed. Elena closed her book and stood, sensing the weight he carried. "I may not be able to protect everything," he said finally, his voice quieter than she had ever heard it. "There are forces moving against me, against us, that even my influence may not stop." The words chilled her. For months she had lived in a balance between fear and hope, but this was the first time he admitted weakness. She crossed the room slowly, her heart racing, and for the first time since they had met she reached for his hand. "Then we face it together," she said simply. Her words were steady, but inside she trembled at her own courage. Damien studied her, his dark eyes unreadable. Then almost imperceptibly his hand tightened around hers. It was not the grip of a man used to dominance, but of a man startled by solidarity. Something shifted between them in that moment. The walls they had both built around their hearts cracked just enough to let light in. The storm outside mirrored the storm that soon followed in their lives. The next weeks were a whirlwind of public scrutiny and private tension. Elena's outreach program was attacked in the press as a shallow attempt to polish Cross Enterprises' image. Headlines painted her as a spoiled politician's daughter living off a billionaire's wealth. Damien's rivals leaked false reports, attempting to paint him as corrupt. Invitations to galas turned into interrogations. Reporters shouted questions, cameras flashed wherever they went. Through it all, Elena stood beside Damien, her chin lifted, her presence steady. At first she feared she was failing, that her role as his wife was only feeding the fire. But then something remarkable happened. People began to notice her sincerity. They saw how she worked with children in underfunded schools, how she spent hours drafting lesson plans, how she listened to families and fought to secure resources. The narrative began to shift. She was not just the billionaire's wife. She was a woman with purpose. And slowly the world began to respect her not as part of his empire, but as the heart within it. One evening, after a particularly brutal day in which Damien had fought a losing battle with a board of directors, he returned home late. Elena was waiting for him, papers spread across her desk, her hair falling loose around her shoulders. When he entered, she expected him to retreat into silence, as he often did when weighed down. Instead, he walked straight to her, dropping heavily into the chair across from her. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then finally he spoke. "You've changed this place," he said quietly. "You've changed me." Elena froze, her pen slipping from her hand. She had not expected him to say it, not aloud. But she saw it in his eyes. The acknowledgement of a truth they had both danced around for months. "I did what I had to do," she replied softly. "You gave me no choice." A faint smile touched his lips, weary but genuine. "No, Elena, you could have surrendered. You could have become the ornament I expected. Instead, you fought for yourself. And in doing so, you taught me what it means to fight for more than just power." The silence between them stretched, no longer heavy but fragile, filled with words neither dared speak yet. For the first time, Elena realized that love, the thing she had thought impossible in this marriage of necessity, was not a luxury after all. It was a seed, small and vulnerable, but growing quietly between them. The crisis reached its peak when one of Damien's fiercest rivals launched a public attack, threatening to expose fabricated evidence that could ruin his company. It was Elena, not Damien, who stepped forward. She called a press conference, standing before cameras with steady eyes, and spoke not of contracts or profits but of integrity, education, and the children whose lives had already been changed by the outreach program. She spoke of the man she had come to know, not the ruthless billionaire painted in headlines, but the man who had supported her studies, respected her voice, and stood silently beside her when the world judged too harshly. Her words cut through the noise, not because they were grand, but because they were true. When she returned to the mansion, shaken but proud, Damien was waiting. For once, the impenetrable mask was gone. He crossed the room and, without hesitation, pulled her into his arms. It was not the embrace of a man sealing a deal, but of a man who had finally understood the meaning of partnership. "You saved more than my company today," he murmured against her hair. "You saved me." Elena closed her eyes, her heart pounding. The girl who had once been forced into a deal to protect her father's name had become a woman who stood tall in her own right, who had discovered strength where she thought she had none, and who had transformed a cage into a place where wings could finally spread. In the months that followed, the storms gradually calmed. The rivals retreated, the false reports crumbled under scrutiny, and Cross Enterprises emerged bruised but stronger. Elena continued her studies, balancing university work with her outreach program, carving a place in society that was hers alone. Damien, for his part, began to change too, still reserved, still disciplined, but less alone. He no longer walked through rooms like a fortress of silence. He walked beside her, and in his eyes she saw not just power but trust. Their marriage had begun as a transaction, a cold agreement struck in desperation. But as seasons changed, so did they. The deal that once chained them had transformed into something neither had expected, into destiny. And though Elena knew the path ahead would not be free of trials, she no longer feared it. For the first time, she was not walking alone.